Welcome, dear friends, to a tranquil journey through the ancient and mystical tales of Loki, the trickster god of Norse mythology. Tonight, we will drift through the winding paths of his fascinating life, exploring the many layers of this enigmatic figure, the god of mischief, shape-shifting, and clever schemes. Loki's story weaves through the realms of gods, giants, and heroes as he moves from playful companion to dark betrayer, all while embodying a complex duality that has captivated minds for centuries. As we float through his ancient myths, you will learn of his cunning tricks, his intricate relationships with gods like Odin and Thor, and the profound impact he had on the fate of the nine realms. In the stillness of the night, let us step together into a world where trickery, wisdom, and destiny intertwine. Now take a deep breath. Feel the weight of your day dissolve into the quiet of the present moment. Let each exhale carry away the tension in your body as your mind begins to relax, allowing the stories of Loki to settle softly within you. You are safe here in the embrace of the night, where stories unfold like gentle dreams. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys through mythology, you're welcome to subscribe and softly tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let us begin Loki's story with the first whispers of his origins. In the beginning, Loki's origins were as mysterious as the winds themselves, swirling through the void of Ginnungagap. Unlike the other gods, whose birth is often marked by clarity and grandeur, Loki's arrival in the Norse world is shrouded in ambiguity, giving him the very essence of trickery and uncertainty. Some say he was born in Jotunheim, the land of the giants, while others claim his roots lie deep within the heart of the primordial chaos, the great expanse before time and matter took form. Whatever his beginnings, Loki's arrival was no simple event. It signified the birth of something unlike anything the nine realms had ever known, a force capable of bending the very fabric of fate itself. Loki was no ordinary god. He wasn't a mighty warrior like Thor, nor a wise king like Odin. Instead, Loki was a shapeshifter, a trickster, a being who defied the very nature of the gods. His appearance, too, was ever-changing, like the shifting tides of the sea. Sometimes, Loki was a handsome youth with a quick smile and a sly gleam in his eye, while other times he would take on the form of a serpent, a bird, or even a mare. He could be a friend one moment and a foe the next, his loyalty as fluid as his form. Loki's father, Farbauti, was a giant, and his mother, Laufey, was of the Jotun bloodline as well. This made Loki both a god and a giant, straddling two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He was the child of chaos and order, a being that bridged the gap between the divine and the monstrous, forever an outsider in both realms. This dual nature would define Loki's role in the saga of the gods. From the very start, Loki's relationship with the gods was one of ambivalence. Though his origins were rooted in the wild, untamed land of the Jotun, he found his way into Asgard, the home of the gods. It was Odin, the All-Father, who welcomed him into the fold. In many ways, Odin saw a reflection of himself in Loki, a god who, like him, sought knowledge and power through unorthodox means. Loki's cleverness and cunning were seen as an asset, and he quickly became a companion to the mighty Thor, Odin's son, who was anything but subtle. Where Thor was raw power and strength, Loki was wit and agility, and together they formed an unlikely but potent team. Despite their differences, Loki and Thor forged a bond of camaraderie. Loki would often accompany Thor on his adventures, using his sharp mind to solve problems that Thor's brute strength could not. Yet, even in these moments of companionship, Loki's true nature would sometimes show through, as his trickster tendencies would often lead to chaos and confusion. Thor's patience with Loki was tested time and time again, but he remained loyal to his friend, even when Loki's pranks went too far. It was in these early moments that Loki's reputation as a trickster began to take shape. Loki delighted in playing tricks on both gods and mortals alike. He would create elaborate illusions, deceive others with his cunning words, and often find himself in the middle of a situation that required a quick solution. But Loki's tricks were not always harmless. Sometimes they led to unintended consequences, causing strife between the gods and their enemies. Despite this, his role in the pantheon remained secure, as his cleverness was considered an essential part of the gods' success. Loki's antics were not confined to mischief alone. He was also a shapeshifter, and his transformations became a defining trait of his identity. Loki could take the form of anything he desired, whether it was a beautiful maiden, a mighty beast, or even a tree. His ability to shapeshift allowed him to infiltrate the hearts and minds of others, gaining their trust or manipulating their fears with ease. It was said that he could change into any form to suit his needs, using his talents to sway the fates of both gods and mortals. Despite Loki's trickery, there were moments when his loyalty to the gods shone through. He helped Thor retrieve his stolen hammer, Mjolnir, by devising a clever plan that allowed the thunder god to regain his weapon and defeat the giants who had taken it. Loki's quick thinking and devious nature were invaluable in this moment, proving that his talents, though often used for mischief, could be employed for good. Yet, even in these acts of loyalty, there was always an underlying tension, a sense that Loki's motives were never entirely pure. Loki's ability to deceive and manipulate was not limited to the gods. He also had a deep connection with the giants, the very beings from whom he hailed. Loki's relationship with the giants was complex, as he often found himself caught between the gods and the giants, his two heritage lines pulling him in opposite directions. Sometimes, Loki would ally himself with the giants, using his cunning to aid them in their conflicts with the gods. At other times, he would betray the giants for the sake of his divine companions, often without warning or explanation. This dual allegiance made Loki both a valuable ally and a dangerous foe. His actions, though unpredictable, were always calculated to serve his own interests, and this made him a figure of both admiration and suspicion among the gods. While Odin and Thor trusted him, they were also wary of his true intentions. They knew that Loki could never be fully relied upon, for his nature was as changeable as the winds. In the moments when Loki was not playing tricks or shifting forms, he was often seen in quiet contemplation. There were times when he would retreat into solitude, pondering the deeper mysteries of existence. Loki was, in his own way, a seeker of knowledge. He sought the answers to questions that no one else dared to ask, and his intellect was as sharp as any of the gods. But his pursuit of knowledge was not without consequences. Loki's thirst for understanding often led him down dark paths, and it was in these moments of quiet reflection that he would hatch his most devious plans. As the winds of Asgard swept through the halls of the gods, Loki's name became synonymous with mischief. His youthful energy, coupled with his insatiable curiosity, led him into many adventures, some harmless and others that would ripple through the nine realms with far reaching consequences. Loki, ever the trickster, took pleasure in outsmarting those who were, by all accounts, far more powerful than he. But his tricks were not always just games. They often held deeper meanings, hidden lessons, and mysterious consequences. One of the first of Loki's legendary misadventures occurred when he befriended the great thunder god, Thor. While Thor was mighty and brave, his strength was often tempered by an innocent naivety, an ideal target for Loki's pranks. Thor, as strong as he was, lacked the wit that Loki possessed. This made him both a friend and at times a victim of Loki's mischievous schemes. Yet in some ways, it was Thor's own straightforward nature that made him the perfect foil for Loki's subtle machinations. Loki's relationship with Thor was one of constant duality. There was a deep, almost sibling like bond between them, and yet it was filled with the chaos of Loki's unpredictable nature. On one occasion, Loki, with his usual flair for deception, orchestrated a contest between Thor and the giants. The prize for the winner was a powerful treasure, one that was said to be more magnificent than anything Thor had ever seen. However, the challenge, as always in Loki's world, was far from straightforward. The contest itself was designed to test not only strength, but also wits. It was Loki's subtle manipulation that ensured that Thor would enter a competition that relied as much on strategy as on raw power. Loki's involvement in the contest was hidden beneath layers of trickery, guiding events in such a way that Thor found himself caught in situations that required more than just his hammer and his strength. What Loki knew, and what Thor discovered too late, was that Loki had planned every twist and turn of the contest to demonstrate the very lesson Loki had been trying to teach all along, that strength alone, while mighty, was never enough. There had to be wisdom behind it, a deeper understanding of the world. But Loki's games were never entirely harmless, as Thor would soon find out. It was in his interaction with the god of thunder that Loki's first major betrayal began to take root. During a journey to the land of the giants, Loki led Thor into a trap, the likes of which had never been seen before. Thor, ever trusting of Loki's cunning, was caught off guard when Loki manipulated events in such a way that he was forced into a duel with one of the most formidable giants of all, a creature who matched Thor's strength and perhaps even exceeded it in intelligence. The battle, of course, was no fair contest. The giant was prepared, having been set up by Loki as part of a larger plan to teach Thor a lesson he would never forget. But in the heat of the moment, with Mjolnir raised high, Thor defeated his opponent in the end. The experience, however, left him shaken. It was clear that Loki's true nature had been at play, and yet Thor was unable to resist his friend's calls for forgiveness. Despite his growing suspicion of Loki's motives, Thor could not sever the bond they shared. But Loki's mischief did not end with Thor. His reach extended far beyond the thunder god and into the very heart of Asgard itself. His next great prank involved the beloved goddess Idun, the keeper of the golden apples of youth. These apples, which bestowed eternal youth upon the gods, were essential to the gods' immortality. Without them, even the gods of Asgard would grow old and die. Loki, ever the schemer, realized that if he could take these apples away, the gods would be left vulnerable, It was in this moment that Loki's mischief began to show a more dangerous edge. Using his shape shifting abilities, Loki disguised himself as a bird and flew into Eden's garden. There, he used his wiles to convince the goddess that she should come with him, promising her that he had a great treasure to show her. But as they flew into the skies, Loki revealed his true intentions. He had made a deal with the giants, a deal that would ensure he received a reward far greater than the simple apples of youth. Loki led Idun straight into the hands of the giants, abandoning her to their cruel mercy. As the giants carried her away, the gods of Asgard were left to age and weaken, their immortality slipping through their fingers like sand. The impact of this betrayal was immediate and profound. The gods of Asgard grew weaker with each passing day, their once immortal bodies beginning to show the signs of age. It was only through Thor's quick thinking and the help of his brother Balder that they managed to rescue Idun and restore the apples to their rightful place. But Loki's treachery had left an indelible mark on the gods. For the first time, they saw Loki not as a mere mischief maker, but as a dangerous force whose actions could have catastrophic consequences. Even as the gods forgave him, there remained an underlying mistrust. Loki's pranks, though often amusing, had a darker edge, a hint of malice that made them far more than simple games. He reveled in the chaos he caused, and yet he also understood that chaos was the natural state of the universe. To Loki, order was an illusion, a temporary construct that only served to restrict the true potential of the world. As Loki continued his pranks, his relationship with the gods grew more strained. He was no longer seen simply as a mischievous companion, but as a figure who had the potential to destroy the very foundations of Asgard itself. And yet, the gods could not rid themselves of him. His intellect, his cunning, and his ability to manipulate the fates of both gods and mortals were too valuable to cast aside. Loki had a way of getting things done, even if his methods were often less than noble. The gods' dependence on Loki would only grow in the coming years, and it would be in the wake of his greatest betrayals that they would begin to see the true cost of his trickery. In the depths of Loki's mischief, a storm was brewing, one that would ultimately shake the very foundations of Asgard and the world itself. Loki's most renowned skill, the one that defined his very essence, was his shape-shifting ability. Unlike any other god or creature in the 9 realms, Loki could transform at will, slipping from one form to another as effortlessly as the changing winds. This gift made him both a trickster and a tool of great power, capable of slipping through the cracks of reality and manipulating events from the shadows. His shape-shifting was not simply about physical transformation. It was about control, control over perception, fate, and the very nature of those around him. In the earliest days of his mischievous career, Loki's shape-shifting was a tool for playful pranks, tricks, and illusions. He would often take the form of a bird, flitting through Asgard, laughing at the gods below as they struggled to find him. At other times, he became a serpent, slithering through the cracks in the earth, whispering lies and sowing discord. He would change his appearance to manipulate the perceptions of others, hiding his true intentions behind the mask of another form. No one could ever truly know who Loki was, for his face was as mutable as the clouds themselves. But Loki's shape-shifting abilities were more than just a means of creating mischief. They were the key to his influence and his manipulation of the fates of the gods. His most famous transformation occurred when he took the form of a mare in order to trick a giant into performing a task for the gods. The story of how Loki became a mare is one of the most peculiar and legendary of all his many adventures. The giant, who had constructed walls around Asgard as part of a bargain with the gods, had set an impossible condition that he would complete the walls in a single winter, and if he succeeded, he would be rewarded with the goddess Freya's hand in marriage, as well as the sun and the moon. The gods, desperate to prevent such a fate, turned to Loki for help. It was Loki, with his uncanny wit, who concocted the idea to sabotage the giant's efforts. Rather than confront the giant directly, Loki chose to take a far more subtle approach. He transformed into a mare, seducing the giant's stallion and leading him away from his work. With the horse distracted, the giant was unable to complete the task in time, and Loki's trickery saved the gods from the terrible bargain. However, Loki's transformation into a mare came with its own consequences. While in his mare form, he became pregnant by the stallion, and in due time, he gave birth to Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse who would become Odin's most loyal steed. Sleipnir, with his unmatched speed and power, was a gift that would prove invaluable to Odin in the future. But for Loki, the birth of Sleipnir marked a turning point in his relationship with the gods. His shape-shifting, once a tool for innocent amusement, had now produced an offspring that would forever tie him to the god of wisdom and war. The birth of Sleipnir also revealed the deeper layers of Loki's power, that his transformations could not only affect the present moment, but shape the course of history itself. But Loki's shape-shifting was not always a means of trickery or transformation for the gods. There were times when it served as a way to escape his own consequences. Loki's ability to slip into another form was often his greatest escape from the anger and retribution of those he had wronged. In the aftermath of his betrayal of Idun, Loki had no choice but to disguise himself in various forms to avoid the wrath of the gods. He would become a bird, flitting about the skies, or a fish, slipping through the water, always avoiding the consequences of his actions. But no matter how many times Loki changed his shape, the truth of his betrayals could never be hidden for long. In the same way, his ability to shift between forms allowed him to manipulate the world around him, setting the stage for future conflicts. He used his skill to enter the dreams of the gods, planting seeds of doubt and fear where none had existed before. He would take the shape of an old wise woman to counsel Odin, or the form of some young and innocent maiden to ensnare a god's heart. His transformations could create illusions that were so convincing, even the sharpest minds in Asgard were left bewildered, unsure whether they had been deceived or whether reality itself had shifted. Yet even in his transformations, Loki was always playing a dangerous game. He was never fully in control of the outcomes, for his shape-shifting powers, like his nature, were unpredictable. Sometimes, his transformations would have unintended consequences. In one of his more infamous pranks, Loki took the form of a fly to escape the grasp of an angry Thor, only to accidentally lead him into the trap of a giantess. And in another instance, Loki's form as a beautiful woman led him into the hands of a giant who sought to claim him as his bride. It was only through his quick thinking and the use of his shape shifting ability that he was able to escape these traps and return to the safety of Asgard. But despite the risks, Loki never shied away from the power his shape shifting gave him. It was a part of who he was, a tool that allowed him to manipulate the events of the nine realms to his advantage. He would use it to escape the wrath of his enemies, to control the actions of his allies, and to craft stories that would become legend. His transformations were a reflection of his very soul, a being who could not be pinned down, whose motives were as fluid and shifting as the forms he took. In many ways, Loki's shape-shifting was a metaphor for his life. He was a being who could not be defined, a god who could slip through the cracks of reality and change the course of fate with a simple twist. He was neither fully god, nor fully giant, neither friend nor foe, but rather something in between, always changing, always evolving, and always leaving those around him uncertain of where he truly stood. The relationship between Loki and Thor was one of both friendship and tension, woven together by a shared history of adventure, danger, and mutual respect. From the earliest days of their companionship, the two gods were inseparable, like two sides of the same coin. While Thor was powerful, righteous, and often a force of destruction, Loki was clever, unpredictable, and full of mischief. Thor, with his brute strength, was often the hammer, and Loki, with his quick wit, was the wielder of that hammer, steering the path with cunning and guile. At first glance, they appeared to be polar opposites. Thor, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, was a protector of Asgard and a god of thunder, his power unmatched in physical strength. He was revered by all, a towering figure who embodied the ideals of courage, honor, and valor. Loki, on the other hand, was far less predictable. His powers were not ones of brute force. Instead, they lay in his ability to deceive, manipulate, and outsmart his foes. Where Thor relied on his strength and might, Loki relied on his intelligence and trickery. And yet, despite their differences, the two were bound together by an unspoken understanding, a recognition of each other's strengths and weaknesses. Thor, in his simple, direct way, admired Loki's intelligence and wit. Though Thor often found himself at the mercy of Loki's pranks and schemes, he could not deny the usefulness of his friend's sharp mind. There were countless times when Thor's might alone was not enough to overcome the challenges they faced, and it was Loki who came up with the strategies that turned the tide in their favor. Loki, for his part, admired Thor's strength and bravery, though he often made light of it. Despite his trickster nature, Loki could not help but respect the thunder god's raw power and relentless determination. One of their most famous adventures, one that would cement their bond and define their relationship, was the quest for the stolen hammer Mjolnir. The hammer, Thor's most prized possession, was taken by the giant Thrym, who demanded the hand of the goddess Freya in marriage as ransom for its return. Thor, enraged and desperate, sought Loki's counsel. It was Loki, with his quick thinking and silver tongue, who devised a plan to retrieve the hammer and rescue Freya from the clutches of Thrym. Loki, ever the schemer, suggested a daring and unconventional plan. Thor would disguise himself as Freya, and Loki would accompany him, disguised as a servant. The two gods, often seen as polar opposites, would infiltrate the giant's hall, pretending to be the bride and her handmaiden. Thor, dressed in the bridal gown, would hide his true identity beneath layers of deception, while Loki, ever the manipulator, would guide the situation from the shadows, pulling the strings with subtlety and precision. The plan, though absurd, was a success. Thor, despite his discomfort in the feminine attire, played the role of Freya convincingly enough to fool Thrym and his court. Meanwhile, Loki used his wit to navigate the situation, making sly remarks and managing the delicate diplomacy that came with the ruse. In the end, Thor's hammer was returned, and Freya was spared, but the adventure had a lasting impact on both gods, as it revealed just how deeply they relied on one another. For Thor, the experience solidified his trust in Loki. Though he often found himself exasperated by Loki's tricks, he knew that, when it counted, his friend's cunning and intellect would always come through. Loki, too, came to appreciate Thor in a way he hadn't before. The Thunder God's unshakable determination and loyalty had proven to be a powerful force in their shared journey, and Loki, despite his own nature, could not help but respect it. The bond between them, forged through shared danger and mutual dependence, grew stronger with each passing trial. But as their bond grew, so did the underlying tension between them. Loki's mischief, while often harmless in the grand scheme of things, began to take on darker tones. His tricks became more elaborate and at times cruel. It was as if Loki, in his desire for chaos, was pushing the limits of their friendship, testing the patience of his companions, and particularly of Thor. The playful banter they once shared started to sour, as Thor found himself increasingly at odds with Loki's antics. One of the most significant moments in their relationship came when Loki, in one of his darker schemes, set in motion the events that would lead to the death of Thor's beloved brother, Balder. Loki's jealousy and bitterness were brought to the forefront during this period. Thor, who had been the closest to his brother, was devastated by Balder's death. But Loki, ever the instigator, found a way to twist the knife further. He had played a role in the scheme that led to Balder's demise, and though he didn't directly cause the death, his actions set the stage for it. The death of Balder marked a turning point in their friendship. Thor, grief-stricken and furious, could no longer turn a blind eye to Loki's treachery. While Loki had always been a source of mischief, this was something far darker, something that shook the very foundation of their bond. Thor's anger was palpable, and for the first time, Loki found himself facing the wrath of his closest ally. But even in the face of Thor's fury, Loki did not relent. He would not apologize for his actions, nor would he admit to the true extent of his role in Balder's death. Despite the betrayal, however, Loki was not cast out entirely. The gods, for all their anger and suspicion, still needed him. His cunning was a tool they could not afford to lose. Thor, though deeply hurt by his friend's actions, knew that Loki's intellect was essential for the survival of Asgard. The bond between them, though tested and strained, remained unbroken for now. The dynamic between Thor and Loki, built on trust, trickery, and mutual respect, continued to evolve. There were moments of tension, moments of reconciliation, but ultimately, the two gods remained intertwined in ways neither could fully understand. Thor, with his raw strength and simple heart, could never fully grasp the complexity of Loki's mind, and Loki, with his sharp wit and mercurial nature, could never fully appreciate the depth of Thor's loyalty. Yet despite their differences, they were bound together, destined to walk the same path until the very end. Loki's ability to shapeshift had always been a source of both admiration and suspicion among the gods. But it was during one of the most unusual and surprising events in his life that his powers would take a turn towards the extraordinary. It all began with a seemingly simple contract, a wager between the gods and a giant. The giant, who was known as the Builder, had come to Asgard with an offer that seemed too good to refuse. He promised to build a wall around Asgard so strong and impregnable that the gods would be safe from any outside threats. But there was a catch. He would demand an outrageous price for his work. If he succeeded in completing the wall in just one winter, he would be rewarded with the goddess Freya's hand in marriage, as well as the sun and the moon. The gods, unwilling to part with such valuable treasures, found themselves in a quandary. They could not afford to lose Freya, the radiant goddess of love and fertility, nor could they bear the thought of the sun and moon being taken from them. Yet the builder's offer was tempting, and the gods were desperate for a solution. It was Loki, ever the trickster, who devised a plan to thwart the giant's ambitions and prevent the gods from losing everything they held dear. Loki, with his clever mind and mischievous nature, convinced the gods that they should accept the giant's challenge, knowing that the task was impossible. The builder would have to complete the wall in a single winter, a task that would require a feat of strength and skill beyond even the most powerful of beings. Loki, in his usual fashion, saw an opportunity to make the best of the situation. He secretly promised the giant that if he succeeded in completing the wall, he would receive the reward he desired. But Loki had a hidden agenda. His true plan was to ensure that the giant could never finish the wall in time. To sabotage the builder's efforts, Loki took on an unexpected form. He transformed into a mare, a beautiful, tempting mare, and used his new form to lure the giant's powerful stallion away from his work. The giant's horse, strong and tireless, had been assisting in the construction of the wall, hauling massive stones and speeding up the process. Loki, in his mare form, seduced the stallion and led it away from the work site, leaving the giant's project incomplete. The scheme worked perfectly. The giant's horse, distracted by Loki's cunning, was no longer available to help with the wall. As the winter grew colder and the deadline approached, it became clear that the giant would not be able to finish the task in time. The gods, delighted by Loki's success, celebrated their victory. They had outwitted the giant, and they would not have to give up Freya, nor would they lose the sun and the moon. But Loki's plan, as often happened with his schemes, had unintended consequences. While in his mare form, Loki became pregnant by the stallion, and in due time he gave birth to a most unusual offspring, Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse. Sleipnir was a magnificent creature, unlike any other horse in the 9 realms. His body was sleek and powerful, with 8 legs that allowed him to run faster than the wind itself. He was a creature of unmatched speed and strength, and soon Sleipnir became Odin's trusted steed, carrying him through the realms on his many journeys. The birth of Sleipnir marked a pivotal moment in Loki's life. Though the outcome of the giant's challenge was a victory for the gods, Loki's actions had resulted in the birth of a creature that would forever tie him to Odin, the All-Father. Sleipnir, with his 8 legs, would become one of the most important symbols of Odin's power and authority. And yet, despite the honor of his creation, Loki could not escape the fact that he had, in some ways, betrayed the gods. His trickery had led to the birth of an offspring that would serve Odin, the very god who, in many ways, stood as the opposite of Loki. In the aftermath of Sleipnir's birth, Loki did not express the joy that one might expect from a father. Instead, he seemed somewhat detached, as if his involvement in the events had been one of mere necessity. He had used his powers to deceive and manipulate, and in the end, it had resulted in the birth of a horse that would serve a different master. Loki's connection to Sleipnir, while undeniable, was one of complexity. He had brought the horse into the world through his own actions, but he did not seem to feel the same pride that others might have felt in the birth of such a remarkable creature. Odin, for his part, was grateful for Sleipnir's speed and power. Sleipnir became a central figure in Odin's mythos, carrying the god through the heavens, across the land of the living, and even into the realms of the dead. The horse was a symbol of Odin's power and authority, and he became inseparable from the All-Father. Sleipnir would accompany Odin on his many quests, and it was said that the horse's 8 legs allowed him to run across the sky, bridging the gap between the realms and carrying his master wherever he needed to go. For Loki, the birth of Sleipnir was yet another twist in the tangled web of his fate. His actions, once again, had set in motion events that he could not fully control. The birth of the horse was a reminder that Loki's tricks and schemes, though often effective in achieving his goals, had consequences that rippled through the lives of those around him. Loki was a master of manipulation, but even he could not fully anticipate the outcome of his own actions. In the case of Sleipnir, his trickery had created something both magnificent and deeply connected to the very gods he both served and undermined. And so, Loki's bond with Odin was further solidified by the birth of Sleipnir, though it was a bond tinged with complexity and ambivalence. While Odin valued the creature, Loki could not fully embrace his creation. Sleipnir, for all his power, would forever be a reminder to Loki of the consequences of his own shape-shifting and trickery. In a way, Sleipnir represented both the best and worst of Loki, a creature born from his deception, yet a being of incredible strength and beauty. Loki's mischief and cunning were ever at play, even in the most seemingly innocent of situations. But there was one event in his life where his trickery would lead to something far more significant, an artifact of unimaginable power. It was a challenge that came not from a giant or a god, but from the very forces of fate themselves. This is the tale of how Loki's scheming led to the creation of Mjolnir, Thor's legendary hammer, the very weapon that would protect the gods in their battles to come. It began with a rivalry between Loki and the sons of Ivaldi, a group of dwarf smiths renowned for their extraordinary skill in crafting magical items. These dwarves had long been known for their ability to forge weapons and artifacts that surpassed the work of any other smiths in the realms. But Loki, ever the trickster, found himself in a contest of pride with the sons of Ivaldi. At the heart of the competition was a wager, one that would see Loki's reputation on the line. In the spirit of mischief, Loki made a bet with the dwarf brothers, claiming that they could not craft anything more magnificent than what he could produce. The bet was simple. Loki would give them a challenge, and they would have to forge something greater than what he could create. But Loki, ever the schemer, did not intend to follow the rules. He had a plan to make sure that the sons of Ivaldi could never win the wager, a plan that would ultimately change the course of history. Loki, knowing the skill of the dwarf brothers, realized that the only way he could ensure victory in this contest was to sabotage their work. He sought out the help of another figure, a being far more devious and clever than any god or giant. This figure was the trickster's equal in cunning and malice, the dwarf called Sindri, who was known for his unmatched ability to forge magical items. Loki, as always, was a master of deception. He approached Sindri with a plan to outdo the sons of Ivaldi and secure his own victory. Loki's scheme was simple. He would disguise himself as a fly, buzzing around the forge as the sons of Ivaldi worked, attempting to distract and disrupt their efforts. He would do whatever it took to sabotage their creations, causing the brothers to fail in their work. And so, the contest began. The sons of Ivaldi set to work on their great creations, each one more magnificent than the last. They crafted a ship that could sail through both water and air, a spear that would never miss its mark, and a golden boar that could run faster than any animal in the world. But Loki, as promised, took to the skies, buzzing about the forge like an irritating fly, doing everything he could to ruin the work of the dwarves. Despite his best efforts, the sons of Ivaldi forged their masterpieces, each one seemingly more perfect than the last. Loki, in a panic, knew that his sabotage had failed. He needed something more, something far more powerful to tip the scales in his favor. It was then that he turned to Sindri, the dark dwarf, and asked for his help. Sindri, ever eager to prove his own skill, agreed to help Loki. He began forging his own creations, ones that would outshine the work of the sons of Ivaldi. But Sindri's creations were not just ordinary items. They were imbued with magical power, each one crafted with the intention of tipping the balance of the contest in Loki's favor. The first of Sindri's creations was a golden boar named Gullinbursti, a creature so swift that it could race across the sky with the speed of the wind. The second creation was a golden ring called Draupnir, which had the power to multiply itself, producing an endless supply of gold. But the final creation was the one that would change everything, the hammer Mjolnir. As Sindri worked the forge, Loki's heart raced with anticipation. This hammer, he knew, would be the ultimate prize in the contest. It would be Thor's weapon, a weapon that would protect the gods from the dangers they faced in the coming years. The hammer, however, was not without its flaws. In Loki's usual manner, his interference with the forge resulted in one small flaw. Mjolnir's handle was shorter than intended. But even with this imperfection, the hammer was a thing of power, a weapon that would become synonymous with Thor's strength. When the creations were complete, the contest was judged, and it was clear that Sindri's work had far surpassed the creations of the sons of Ivaldi. The hammer, Mjolnir, gleamed with an otherworldly light, and the boar, Gullinbursti, stood proud, its golden fur shimmering like the sun. The gods were amazed, and Thor himself could hardly believe that such a powerful weapon had been forged. The hammer was given to Thor, and it would become his most treasured possession, one that would protect the gods from the giants and other enemies that sought to destroy them. Loki, as always, had manipulated the situation to his own ends. His interference with the sons of Ivaldi had resulted in the creation of Mjolnir, a weapon that would become a symbol of Thor's might. but there was a price to pay for his actions. Loki's rivalry with the sons of Ivaldi had led to a deeper rift between him and the gods as they began to realize just how far Loki was willing to go in his schemes. Though the hammer was a symbol of protection and power, it was also a reminder of Loki's dangerous ability to manipulate the fates of others. As Thor wielded Mjolnir in the battles to come, Loki stood in the shadows, knowing that his actions had shaped the destiny of the gods. The hammer, though forged by the hands of Sindri, was ultimately the result of Loki's machinations. It was a weapon that would protect the gods, but it was also a symbol of Loki's ability to alter the course of fate itself. Loki's existence, woven between the gods and the giants, was a paradox that shaped his every action and decision. He was neither fully divine nor fully monstrous. He was a creature of the in-between, always caught between the realms of Asgard and Jotunheim. The giants, or Jötnar as they were known, were ancient beings, powerful, untamable, and often in conflict with the gods. Yet despite this inherent animosity, Loki's ties to the Jotun bloodline ran deep. His father, Farbauti, was a giant, and his mother, Laufey, was of the Jotun race as well. This heritage gave Loki an understanding of the giants that no other god could claim, and it made him a figure of both admiration and suspicion in the eyes of the gods. While Loki often found himself at odds with the giants, there were times when he allied himself with them, using his cunning to manipulate situations in their favor. This shifting allegiance between the gods and the giants allowed Loki to navigate the dangerous political landscape of the Nine Realms. At times, he was a champion of Asgard, helping the gods in their battles against their enemies. At other times, he would slip into the role of a betrayer, using his knowledge of the gods' weaknesses to aid the giants in their schemes. One of Loki's earliest interactions with the giants came when he was still young, full of mischief, and eager to prove his worth. The giants, who were often seen as enemies by the gods, had long sought to undermine Asgard's power, and Loki was caught in the crossfire. Despite the tension between the two sides, Loki found himself drawn to the giants in a way that was difficult for the gods to understand. His father's blood ran through his veins, and the pull of his Jotun heritage was undeniable. It was during this time that Loki's relationship with the mighty giant Thrym began to take shape. Thrym, a powerful and ambitious giant, sought to marry the goddess Freya, believing that by claiming her as his bride, he could secure his place as one of the most powerful beings in all the Nine Realms. Loki, ever the schemer, saw an opportunity in this. Thrym's demand was simple. He would only give back Thor's stolen hammer, Mjolnir, if he was given Freya's hand in marriage. Loki, knowing that the gods could never allow such a union to take place, concocted a plan that would both save Freya and retrieve Mjolnir. In a moment of sheer audacity, Loki suggested that Thor disguise himself as Freya and pretend to be the bride that Thrym sought. The idea was outlandish, but Loki knew that it was the only way to get Thor close enough to retrieve the hammer and defeat the giant. The plan would require Thor to dress in a bridal gown, a garment far removed from the warrior's usual attire, and to take part in a marriage ceremony that would test the limits of his patience and pride. The plan, as always with Loki's schemes, was fraught with danger and uncertainty. Loki, ever the master of deception, accompanied Thor to the giant's hall, disguised as a servant. The two gods infiltrated the feast, with Thor trying his best to play the role of a reluctant bride, while Loki, ever the manipulator, worked his magic in the background. The giant Thrym, convinced that he had won the most beautiful bride in all the realms, proceeded with the ceremony, unaware of the true identity of his bride. It was in this moment of deception that Loki's influence over the giants became clear. Though the gods were the natural enemies of the Jotun, Loki was able to weave his way through both realms, playing the role of mediator, trickster, and strategist. His shape-shifting and ability to bend reality allowed him to deceive both the gods and the giants, a skill that made him invaluable to the gods in times of crisis. And yet, as Loki continued to aid the gods in their struggles, his loyalties to the giants remained ever present. Loki's dealings with the giants were not always motivated by malice or greed. At times, he genuinely sought to strike a balance between the two sides. However, his actions often had unintended consequences, as the gods began to realize that Loki's true allegiance was not always with them. Loki's love for mischief, his deep connection to his Jotun heritage, and his desire for power meant that he was always one step ahead of those who sought to control him. He was a god of unpredictable nature, someone who could never be fully trusted, but who could never be fully dismissed either. In another instance, Loki's dealings with the giants would lead to the creation of yet another powerful artifact, one that would prove to be instrumental in the fate of the gods. The story of how Loki helped the giant builder construct the wall around Asgard is one that exemplifies the duality of his character. While Loki's assistance in sabotaging the builder's work was necessary to prevent the loss of Freya's and the sun and moon, it also cemented his role as an agent of chaos, someone who could not be fully controlled. Yet despite Loki's often ambiguous alliances, the gods continued to rely on him. His knowledge of the giants' ways, his ability to manipulate situations, and his talent for creating solutions in the most dire of circumstances made him a valuable asset to Asgard. Loki's role in the defense of the gods was not one of brute strength, but one of strategy and intellect. In this way, he was an invaluable ally, even as his nature remained a constant source of tension between the gods and the giants. As the years passed, Loki's relationship with the giants grew more complex. He found himself drawn to the Jotunheim realm, where he would often take part in schemes that involved both gods and giants. It was here that he would witness firsthand the struggle for power that existed between the two realms. The giants, though formidable in their own right, were often seen as chaotic and destructive forces bent on overthrowing the gods. Loki, however, saw things differently. His ability to understand both sides, to see the flaws in both the gods and the giants, allowed him to navigate the political landscape of the Nine Realms in ways that no one else could. The giants, like Loki, were creatures of contradiction. They were both powerful and vulnerable, intelligent and reckless. And in many ways, Loki found himself torn between his loyalty to the gods and his deep connection to the giants. This duality was something that defined his very being, and it would continue to shape his actions in the years to come. Among the gods of Asgard, there was one who was revered above all others for her grace, wisdom, and the life-giving gift she brought to the divine realm. This was Idun, the goddess of youth, who tended to the golden apples that sustained the gods' immortality. These apples were not mere fruits, they were the embodiment of life itself, granting eternal youth and vitality to the gods, ensuring that they remained untouched by the ravages of time. Without Idun's apples, the gods would wither and age, losing their divine essence. But Loki, ever the trickster, saw an opportunity in this divine balance. He understood that the apples were the gods' most precious possession, and he realized that if he could control the fate of Idun and her apples, he could shake the very foundation of Asgard itself. It was in this moment of ambition that Loki's darker nature began to surface. Loki's plan was deceptively simple. He knew that the giants, who constantly sought to undermine the gods, would stop at nothing to get their hands on Idun's apples. The giant Thiazi, a creature of formidable strength and cunning, had long coveted the apples of youth. Loki, in his usual fashion, manipulated events, using his words and promises to strike a deal with Thiazi, one that would leave the gods vulnerable and at the mercy of their enemies. Disguising himself as a friend, Loki approached Idun under the guise of a trusted companion. He told her that he had found a beautiful forest beyond the realms, a place where she could gather even more wondrous apples, fruit that would make her own gifts to the gods even more potent. Enthralled by the idea of acquiring even more power to bestow upon the gods, Idun agreed to accompany Loki on his journey. Unbeknownst to her, the path they were about to take was far from what it seemed. Loki led Idun into the deep forests of Jotunheim, the land of the giants. The air grew colder with each step, and the familiar warmth of Asgard seemed to fade away. It was a treacherous path, but Loki, ever the smooth talker, convinced Idun that the rewards would be worth it. As they ventured deeper into the land of the giants, Loki's true intentions began to take shape. Thiazi, the giant who had long plotted to steal Idun's apples, was waiting for them. When they reached the heart of Jotunheim, Loki's deceit was revealed. The moment Idun stepped into the clutches of the giants, she was captured. Thiazi, in his monstrous form, seized the goddess, and the apples were taken from her. Loki, who had led Idun to this fate, watched with a sense of satisfaction as the giants left with their prize. His part in the betrayal was complete. The gods of Asgard were now left vulnerable, their immortality slipping away as time began to take its toll. As the giants retreated to their home, Loki's victory was tempered by the knowledge that his actions would not go unnoticed. The gods, despite their powerful nature, were dependent on the apples that Idun tended to, and without them, they would begin to age, grow weak, and eventually die. Loki, despite his deception, understood the gravity of his actions. His trickery had placed the gods in peril, and the balance of the 9 realms was shifting. Loki, however, was not one to let guilt or consequence stop him. He had his own plans, and the gods, despite their anger, could not afford to cast him aside. In Asgard, a great panic began to spread. As the gods grew weaker, their vitality fading without the golden apples, their once immortal forms began to show the signs of age. Thor's strength began to falter, and even Odin, the All-Father, could feel his power wane. The gods were desperate to find a solution, but they were powerless without Idun and her apples. It was in this moment of crisis that Loki, ever the opportunist, saw an opening. He knew that the only way to restore balance was to return Idun and the apples to Asgard, but Loki also understood that the gods would not forgive him so easily. He had to act quickly, for the fate of the gods rested on his next move. Realizing that the gods would not be able to survive much longer without Eden's gift, Loki hatched a plan to retrieve her. The gods were in turmoil, their bodies aging by the day, and they needed Eden and her apples more than ever. Loki, with his shape-shifting abilities, knew that he could infiltrate Jotunheim and retrieve the goddess, but he also understood that this mission would not be without its risks. Using his cunning, Loki transformed into a bird and flew swiftly to Jotunheim. Once there, he used his words to persuade the giant Thiazi, promising him riches and power in exchange for Eden's release. He played on Thiazi's desires, convincing him that the gods would be powerless without the apples, and that the true power lay in the hands of the giants. Loki, however, had no intention of honoring his promise. His only goal was to return Eden and her apples to Asgard before the gods were consumed by their own decay. When Thiazi agreed to release Eden, Loki quickly returned to Asgard with the goddess and the precious apples. He had once again saved the gods from certain destruction, but at what cost? His deception, while effective, had left a scar on his relationship with the gods. They knew that Loki had betrayed them, and though they were grateful for his return of Eden and the apples, their trust in him had been irreparably damaged. Loki, ever the trickster, had played a dangerous game, one that had altered the course of history and tested the loyalty of both gods and giants alike. Though the gods were restored to their youthful vitality, the memory of Loki's betrayal would linger. His role in the tricking of Idun and the stealing of her apples was a reminder of the unpredictable and often treacherous nature of the trickster god. For Loki, however, the consequences of his actions were merely another chapter in his ever-evolving story, a tale of manipulation, power, and the relentless pursuit of his own goals. Loki's betrayal of the gods, though often playful in nature, had crossed a line from which there was no return. His trickery, while once seen as harmless mischief, had grown darker over time. He had deceived, manipulated, and even caused the death of Balder, the beloved son of Odin, a crime that would change the very fabric of the gods' trust in him. Balder's death was a turning point in Loki's relationship with the gods, a moment of reckoning that would eventually lead to his downfall. The gods, already suspicious of Loki's motives, were now filled with rage at the thought that he had orchestrated Balder's death. The prophecy surrounding the death of Balder had long haunted the gods, and now that it had come to pass, they could no longer ignore the fact that Loki had played a significant role in fulfilling it. The gods had tried to reason with Loki, but he remained defiant, refusing to admit to his part in the tragic event. Loki's actions had not gone unnoticed in Asgard. The gods, their trust shattered, knew that they could no longer allow him to walk freely among them. They had always relied on Loki's cleverness and wit, but now his deceit had become too great a threat. It was time for the gods to take action. They could not allow Loki, the god of mischief, to continue his dangerous ways. The time had come for Loki to face the consequences of his betrayal. It was Odin, the All-Father, who decided that Loki's punishment would be unlike any other. The gods had long been aware of Loki's shape-shifting abilities, his ability to slip between forms and escape consequences. They knew that they could not simply imprison him in the traditional sense. Instead, Odin devised a plan to bind Loki in a way that would prevent him from escaping his fate. The gods, united in their desire for justice, set out to capture Loki and imprison him for all eternity. Loki, however, was not easily caught. He was always one step ahead of those who sought to restrain him. He had already fled from Asgard once before, taking on the form of a giant serpent to slip through the cracks of the gods' defenses. But this time, there was no escape. The gods, knowing that Loki would not surrender willingly, set a trap for him. They summoned the great chains of the dwarves, crafted from the strongest materials in all the realms, and they prepared to bind Loki in a way that would ensure he could never break free. The gods hunted Loki down, and when they finally found him, they used their combined strength to subdue him. Loki, who had always prided himself on his ability to outwit and escape, found himself trapped in a way that he could not comprehend. The chains, crafted with magic and forged with unbreakable materials, wrapped around Loki, binding him tightly to the ground. But that was not the end of his punishment. For Loki's treachery, the gods knew that his punishment had to be even more severe. To bind Loki completely, the gods took him to a dark cavern beneath the earth. There, in the shadows of Jotunheim, they placed him in a cavernous pit. Loki, bound by the chains that no god, giant, or mortal could break, was forced to lie on the cold stone floor. But the gods did not stop there. In an act of cruelty and finality, they took one of Loki's own sons, Vali, and transformed him into a wolf. The wolf, driven by an uncontrollable rage, attacked his brother, Narfi, and tore him apart. The gods, showing no mercy, used Narfi's entrails to bind Loki even more tightly, making it impossible for him to escape. Loki, now trapped in the darkness, was left to endure his punishment. His once sharp mind, which had been the source of his greatest victories and deceptions, was now powerless against the chains that held him in place. As he lay in the cold, silent darkness, Loki's mind began to unravel. His laughter, once a sound that could bend the very fabric of fate, was replaced with the quiet sobs of a god who had lost everything. The chains that bound him not only held his body, but also bound his spirit, leaving him in a state of helplessness he had never known before. But even in the depths of his despair, Loki's mind remained sharp, his thoughts still swirling with the possibility of escape. He had always been the master of manipulation, and now, even in his confinement, he began to consider how he might turn this situation to his advantage. He knew that the gods had left him in a place where he could not escape, but Loki was not a god who could be easily defeated. He had deceived death itself, and he would find a way to manipulate the fates once more. The punishment Loki faced would last for eternity. The gods, having completed their binding of the trickster god, left him to his fate. Loki's role in the grand tapestry of the 9 realms was far from over, however. His punishment was a necessary part of the prophecy that would unfold in the coming years. For it was said that Loki, bound and tortured, would be the one to bring about the end of the gods during Ragnarok, the great battle that would signal the destruction of the old world and the birth of a new one. In the meantime, as Loki lay bound in the depths of the earth, the gods remained unaware of the true extent of his power. They had bound him in chains, but they had underestimated the force that Loki could summon from the darkness. He was not simply a god of mischief, he was a god of transformation, capable of manipulating reality itself. And though his body was restrained, Loki's mind was as sharp as ever, constantly searching for ways to escape his fate and turn the tide of the future. Among the gods, there was none more beloved than Balder, the shining beacon of light and hope in Asgard. He was the embodiment of goodness, wisdom, and grace, qualities that made him cherished by all. His laughter was like the music of the heavens, and his presence radiated warmth and peace. The gods held him in the highest esteem, and his beauty and purity were unmatched. Balder, son of Odin and Frigg, was fated to be the one who would guide the gods toward a future filled with peace and prosperity. Yet, as with all things in the world of the gods, his destiny would be twisted by the hand of Loki, the ever deceptive trickster. The seeds of Balder's death were sown long before the tragic event took place. It began with a prophecy, one that foretold Balder's demise. This prophecy, whispered in the shadows of Asgard, unsettled the gods, for it spoke of the end of the light that Balder represented. Though the gods trusted in their immortality, the knowledge of this prophecy created a silent tension in the air. They knew that something was coming, something that could not be avoided. Frigg, Balder's mother, was especially distressed by the prophecy. As a mother, she could not bear the thought of losing her son, the one who was the very heart of Asgard. Determined to protect him, Frigg took a vow that she would ensure Balder's safety by making every object in the world swear an oath not to harm him. She went to every living creature, every plant and mineral, and asked them to promise that they would never bring harm to her son. Every creature in Asgard complied, and it seemed as though the prophecy would never come to pass. Balder was safe, or so it appeared. But Loki, ever the troublemaker, saw an opportunity in this divine overconfidence. He knew that the gods had left one crucial element unaccounted for: the mistletoe. A seemingly harmless plant, the mistletoe had not been included in Frigg's list of oaths, as it was considered too weak and insignificant to cause any harm. Loki, ever aware of the vulnerabilities in the gods' plans, knew that this was the one element he could exploit to bring about the doom of Balder. Loki, in his usual manner, set about his devious plan. He approached Hödur, Balder's blind brother, who had been left out of the protection spell due to his blindness. Loki, feigning concern for the gods and their unfulfilled wish to rid themselves of their fear, whispered to Hödur. He handed him a spear made of mistletoe and encouraged him to join in the mock games the gods had begun to play with Balder. The gods, believing their son was invincible, were throwing various objects at him in jest, knowing that none could harm him. Hödur, unsure of the game and unable to see, followed Loki's instructions and hurled the mistletoe spear at his brother. As the spear struck Balder, a terrible silence fell over Asgard. Balder, who had never been harmed, fell to the ground, his bright light extinguished in an instant. The gods, in horror and disbelief, rushed to him, but it was too late. Balder, the shining beacon of the gods, was dead. His lifeless body lay before them, and the entire realm of Asgard seemed to be cast in shadow. Loki, ever the trickster, watched from the shadows as the gods wept for their fallen brother. His laughter, though quiet and hidden, was like a distant echo, the sound of triumph for a god who had caused chaos beyond imagination. The death of Balder was a moment that would forever change the gods, for it marked the beginning of the end. Balder's death would herald the coming of Ragnarok, the final battle that would bring about the end of the gods and the birth of a new world. Frigg, stricken with grief, sought to undo what had been done. She journeyed to Hel, the realm of the dead, where the goddess Hel held the soul of her son. She begged Hel to release Balder, offering anything in exchange for his return. Hel, moved by the queen's grief, agreed to return Balder to life, but only on one condition. She demanded that all beings, both gods and mortals, weep for the fallen god. If even one being refused to mourn him, Balder would remain in Hel's realm forever. The gods sent messengers to every corner of the 9 realms, hoping to find someone who would weep for Balder. To their great dismay, when they arrived at the cave of the giantess Thok, they found that she refused to weep. Thok, who was believed to be Loki in disguise, rejected the plea. "Let Hel keep what she has," she said coldly, her heart as hard as stone. With Thok's refusal, the final seal of fate was placed upon Balder's soul. The gods' hopes of restoring him were dashed, and Balder's soul remained locked in Hel's domain. His death would not be undone, and the prophecy of the end had been fulfilled. The gods, now grieving and filled with a sense of doom, began to realize the full weight of Loki's actions. Loki, the god who had once been a trusted companion, had now become their enemy. His betrayal had not only caused the death of their beloved Balder, but it had also set in motion the forces that would lead to the destruction of all they held dear. The gods knew that they could not allow Loki to remain free, and the moment of reckoning for the trickster god was drawing near. As Loki watched the gods' sorrow unfold, he knew that the time for his punishment had come. His manipulation of Balder's fate had set the stage for the inevitable conflict between the gods and the giants, a conflict that would culminate in the great battle of Ragnarok. Loki's part in this cosmic event was undeniable. He had, with his schemes and trickery, brought about the death of Balder and laid the groundwork for the destruction of the old order. His actions had changed the course of destiny, and the consequences were far-reaching. The death of Balder was a turning point for the gods, a moment that sealed their fate and began the slow, inevitable march toward the end. In the wake of Balder's passing, Asgard was a land of mourning. The gods, once vibrant and powerful, now found themselves facing a future they could not control, a future shaped by prophecy and the shadow of Loki's treachery. Yet in the depths of their despair, there was one force that they had yet to reckon with: Loki himself, the trickster god who had sown chaos and destruction among them. For Loki, the death of Balder marked the culmination of his plan, the moment when the gods' trust in him shattered beyond repair. He had long manipulated events, playing both sides in the struggle between gods and giants, but now he stood at the precipice of his greatest betrayal, one that would lead to Ragnarok, the final battle that would destroy both gods and giants, reshaping the world into something new. Loki knew that his role in the coming apocalypse was essential, and as the gods searched for a way to undo the damage, Loki began to prepare for his ultimate escape. Bound by chains in a dark cavern, Loki had been imprisoned by the gods for his role in Balder's death and the chaos he had caused. His punishment was brutal, as the gods had bound him with the chains forged by the dwarves and left him in the deepest part of the earth. But Loki was no ordinary god. His mind was as sharp as ever, and his desire for vengeance and freedom grew with each passing day. Loki, even in his captivity, plotted his escape, knowing that he could never be fully contained by the gods' restraints. The gods' decision to imprison Loki was one born of necessity. They had no choice but to punish him for the pain and suffering he had caused. His manipulation of the gods' fates, his role in Baldur's death, and his alliance with the giants had all made him a dangerous force, one that could no longer be trusted. Loki's escape from his chains, however, would not come easily. The gods had bound him with the strongest materials they could find, materials that no mortal or divine force could break. But Loki, in his unrelenting desire for freedom, would find a way to escape the prison they had created for him. As the days passed, Loki's anger and frustration simmered beneath the surface. His mind, always quick and calculating, began to turn over the possibilities of escape. He could feel the weight of the chains on his body, but he also knew that they could not hold him forever. In his isolation, Loki began to hatch a plan, one that would allow him to break free and set the events of Ragnarok in motion. The gods, for all their power, had underestimated the depths of Loki's cunning. In his moment of despair, Loki was visited by a figure who, like him, was marked by the shadows of destiny. This figure was Sigyn, his loyal wife, who had stood by him through the darkest of times. Sigyn, the goddess of fidelity and compassion, had never wavered in her love for Loki, even though she knew the harm he had caused. In the depths of Loki's prison, she came to him, bringing with her a bowl to catch the venom that dripped from a serpent that hung above his head. The venom, dripping into Loki's face, was a constant torment, but Sigyn, ever faithful, stood by him, catching the venom in the bowl to alleviate his pain. Loki's escape, however, was not to be granted through kindness or mercy. It would come through his own strength and manipulation, as it always had. While Sigyn tended to the venom, Loki's mind raced with the possibilities of freedom. The chains that bound him were strong, but not invincible. With the right manipulation, Loki knew that he could break free. It was not a matter of strength, but of timing, a matter of waiting for the right moment when the gods would be distracted by their own downfall. The stage for Loki's escape was set. The gods, unaware of the dark forces at work, continued to deal with the fallout from Baldur's death. They had begun to see the signs of Ragnarok, the coming of the end. The earth itself began to tremble, and the sky darkened as the wolves, Fenrir and Sjöll, began to stir. The stars themselves seemed to fade, and the rivers of the underworld began to rise. The prophecy that had long been feared was now unfolding before them. The signs of the end were everywhere, but the gods did not yet realize the true extent of what was happening. And it was at this moment, as the first signs of Ragnarok began to reveal themselves, that Loki made his move. He called upon the powers of darkness and chaos that had always been his to command. The chains that had once held him tight began to loosen, one by one. The gods of mischief, whose name had long been associated with trickery and deception, now turned his attention to the inevitable battle that was to come. With his freedom, Loki would become a harbinger of destruction, a catalyst that would bring the gods to their knees. Loki's escape was a sign of the end, but it was also the beginning of the chaos that would sweep through the 9 realms. His role in Ragnarok was already written in the stars. He would lead the forces of the giants, guiding them to the final confrontation between gods and monsters. The gods had always seen Loki as a wild card, unpredictable and dangerous, but they had never fully grasped the extent of his power. Loki was not merely a god of mischief, he was a god of destiny, capable of shaping the future in ways that no one could foresee. The chains that had bound him now lay shattered at his feet. Loki, free at last, stood ready to fulfill his role in the cosmic battle that was to come. He would no longer be a pawn in the god's game. The trickster god had become the master of his own fate, and his escape was the first step toward the destruction of everything the gods had built. As the world trembled on the brink of Ragnarok, Loki's laughter echoed through the heavens, a sound that heralded the coming storm. The seeds of Loki's ultimate betrayal had been sown long before the events that would lead to Ragnarok. His deep connection to both the gods and the giants placed him in an extraordinarily unique position, one where he could play both sides and manipulate the fates of both realms. But even before the death of Balder, before the chains of his punishment were cast upon him, Loki's role in the great cosmic struggles between gods and giants had already been forged. The Aesir-Vanir War, a war that shaped the very foundation of the Nine Realms, had a role for Loki, one that would see him moving like a shadow between the warring factions. The Aesir, led by Odin, were the gods of power, knowledge, and war. They resided in Asgard, their home of shining halls and mighty fortresses. They were the rulers of the gods, and their realm was seen as a symbol of divine strength and order. The Vanir, on the other hand, were the gods of nature, fertility, and prosperity, and their realm of Vanaheim was one of peace and harmony. For years, the two pantheons coexisted in a tense alliance, but beneath the surface, their rivalry simmered. The Aesir sought to control the realms, while the Vanir, with their connection to the forces of nature, desired a more balanced, peaceful world. The war between the Aesir and the Vanir was inevitable, a conflict driven by both the gods' desires for supremacy and their clashing ideologies. Loki, ever the opportunist, found himself at the heart of this great struggle. Though he was technically an Aesir god, his ties to the Jotun bloodline made him an outsider, someone who could move freely between both sides. In this war, Loki would play the part of mediator, manipulator, and deceiver, all roles that he had mastered throughout his long existence. The war began with a series of skirmishes, each side seeking dominance over the other. As the conflict grew, the gods began to realize that a final resolution was needed. Neither the Aesir nor the Vanir could afford to be in a constant state of war, for the Nine Realms were vast and complex, and the cosmic balance required that some form of peace be restored. This, of course, was where Loki's true talents came into play. Loki was the bridge between the two sides. He knew the minds of the Vanir just as well as he knew the gods of Asgard, and he understood that a direct confrontation would lead only to mutual destruction. He also knew that the war could not end in simple victory for one side or the other. The balance of power must be preserved. And so, Loki, ever the schemer, hatched a plan that would shift the tides of the war in a way that no one could have predicted. The gods, desperate for a resolution, sent Loki to the Vanir to negotiate a truce. Loki, with his silver tongue and cunning intellect, met with the Vanir gods, and in typical Loki fashion, convinced them that peace was not only possible, but necessary. But Loki's negotiations were not as innocent as they seemed. Beneath the surface, he manipulated the terms of the truce to benefit both sides in ways that only he understood. Through Loki's cunning, the war between the Aesir and the Vanir was brought to an end, not through force, but through trickery and deceit. Loki had, in essence, brokered a peace treaty that was built on false promises and subtle manipulation. The truce between the two pantheons was supposed to bring harmony to the nine realms, but in reality, it created an uneasy alliance where neither side fully trusted the other. The aftermath of the war saw the Vanir sending hostages to Asgard as a sign of peace, while the Aesir did the same. Among the hostages sent to Asgard was Njord, the Vanir god of the sea, and his children, Freya and Freyr, both gods of fertility and wealth. These hostages, who would become valuable allies of the Aesir, were a result of Loki's manipulation, and their presence in Asgard would shift the balance of power within the realms. Loki had, once again, altered the course of history by using his knowledge of both sides to create a situation where peace seemed possible, even though, in truth, it was built on the shifting sands of deceit. But even as the gods celebrated the apparent peace, Loki's mind was already working, already devising new schemes. He knew that the truce between the Aesir and the Vanir would never be permanent. In the end, the two pantheons were too different, their goals too conflicting. And so, Loki's manipulations continued, like a silent thread woven through the fabric of both realms. His actions during the war were not the end of his role in shaping the future of the gods, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, one where his ultimate betrayal, the cause of Ragnarok, would unfold. Loki's actions during the Aesir-Vanir War were emblematic of his true nature, a god who could never be fully trusted, a being who played both sides of every conflict, manipulating events for his own benefit. While the gods saw him as an ally, they were always aware, in the back of their minds, that Loki's true loyalty lay not with them, but with himself. His role in the war, though seemingly one of peacekeeping and diplomacy, was ultimately about positioning himself in such a way that he would emerge as the central figure in the chaos that would follow. The peace between the Aesir and Vanir, though established, would never last. It was only a matter of time before Loki's actions, his manipulations, and his dark dealings would come to a head. The gods, despite their apparent triumph in the war, were unaware that they had been playing into Loki's hands. They had given him a position of influence and power, one that would allow him to orchestrate the very events that would lead to their downfall. In the end, the gods of Asgard would find themselves facing the consequences of Loki's schemes, and, as with all of Loki's deeds, the consequences would be far-reaching, destructive, and inevitable. Loki's legacy was not only defined by his cunning and tricks, but also by the offspring he sired, whose fates were inextricably linked to the fate of the gods. These children, born of Loki and various figures of myth, were not the traditional divine offspring of the gods. Instead, they were creatures of immense power and dark destiny, beings whose very existence would change the course of history and ensure that Loki's mark on the nine realms would be felt for centuries to come. Among these children, three stood out: Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel. Each of these offspring was tied to the prophecies of Ragnarok, the end of the world, and their roles in the final battle would define the fate of the gods. These children, born of Loki's unholy union with the giants, were destined to play pivotal roles in the events that would bring about the destruction of Asgard and the rebirth of the world. Loki, ever the trickster, had no idea the true scope of the consequences that would unfold because of his actions. Yet, like everything in his life, his children were part of his larger scheme, a scheme that would unravel the gods and lead to the ultimate judgment of all realms. Fenrir, the giant wolf, was the first and perhaps most terrifying of Loki's children. From the moment he was born, Fenrir was a creature unlike any other, massive and fierce, with eyes that gleamed with primal hunger. Fenrir was a force of nature, a being whose strength would one day be unmatched. His very existence posed a challenge to the gods, who feared his potential to become a weapon of chaos. It was said that Fenrir's fate was tied to the destruction of the gods, and the Aesir knew that he could not be allowed to grow unchecked. In the early days, Fenrir was kept in Asgard, where the gods, ever fearful of his power, attempted to tame him. They were wary of his strength, and despite their best efforts to bond with the wolf, they could not deny the danger he represented. Fenrir's presence in Asgard was a reminder of the gods' fragility, that even within their own ranks, there were beings who could surpass them in strength and fury. It was Odin, the All-Father, who saw the wolf's true potential and feared the day that Fenrir would turn against the gods. To prevent this, the gods decided to bind Fenrir with chains, but they knew that no ordinary chains would suffice. They commissioned the dwarves to craft a magical fetter that would bind the wolf. The chain, known as Gleipnir, was made from 6 impossibly light and intangible materials: the sound of a cat's footsteps, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, and the sinews of a bear. It was said that these materials could never be found in the mortal or divine world, and thus the chain was impossible to break. Fenrir, however, was not easily fooled. When the gods presented Gleipnir, he refused to be bound by it unless one of them placed their hand in his mouth as a sign of trust. The god Tyr, known for his courage and sense of duty, bravely placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth. The moment Fenrir realized that he was trapped, he bit off Tyr's hand in rage. Despite this act of defiance, the gods succeeded in binding the wolf, and Fenrir was cast into a dark, remote cave where he would remain until the day of Ragnarok, when he would break free and bring about the death of Odin himself. Fenrir's fate was sealed the moment he was born. He was destined to bring destruction, and his connection to Loki was the catalyst for the chaos that would follow. But Fenrir was not alone in his dark destiny. His siblings, Jörmungandr and Hel, were also creatures of immense power, each with their own roles to play in the coming apocalypse. Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, was Loki's second child, and like Fenrir, his existence was a harbinger of doom. When Jörmungandr was born, the gods knew that he would be a threat to the world. Odin, in his wisdom, cast the serpent into the ocean that encircled Midgard, the realm of humanity. There, Jörmungandr grew to an enormous size, so vast that he was said to be able to encircle the entire world with his body, holding his own tail in his mouth. His very presence in the oceans was a symbol of the forces of chaos and destruction, a reminder that the end was always looming just beyond the horizon. Jörmungandr's fate, like Fenrir's, was linked to the final battle of Ragnarok. It was said that he and Thor, the thunder god, would face each other in the final moments of the war. The two were fated to clash in an epic battle that would end with both of them perishing. Jormungandr, with his poisonous venom, and Thor, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, would engage in a battle of unimaginable power, each determined to destroy the other. When the serpent's venom struck Thor, it was said that the thunder god would fall, his strength finally overcome. But before his death, Thor would deliver a blow to Jormungandr, killing the serpent in the end. The fate of Jormungandr was one of destruction and chaos, and like his siblings, he was bound to bring about the end of the gods. He was a force of nature, unstoppable and terrifying, his presence a constant reminder of the impending apocalypse. The third of Loki's children was Hel, the goddess of death and ruler of the underworld. Hel's existence was tied to the very nature of mortality, as she governed the souls of those who died in unheroic ways, those who were not honored in battle and were not welcomed into Valhalla. She resided in her realm, Helheim, a cold and bleak place where the souls of the dead languished. Hel's power was vast, for she controlled the fate of the dead, and in the end, it would be her realm that would serve as the setting for the final battle of Ragnarok. Hel's role in the destruction of the gods was clear. She would lead the forces of death against Asgard. Her army would rise from Helheim, bringing the dead with them to wage war on the gods. In the final battle, it was said that Hel would lead the charge, her presence a symbol of the inevitability of death. She would be one of the many forces that would destroy Asgard, but like Fenrir and Jormungandr, she was also a child of Loki, a reminder that his legacy would live on in the darkest corners of the 9 realms. Loki's children were the instruments of fate, and their roles in the coming war would ensure that Ragnarok would unfold as it was destined to. Each of these beings, Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel, was a creature of immense power, born of Loki's own bloodline. Their actions, driven by fate and destiny, would shape the end of the world and the beginning of a new age. In the end, Loki's children would be the ones to bring about the downfall of the gods, but their legacy was also a reminder of the inevitability of change, of the cycles of creation and destruction that define the universe. The threads of fate, as ancient as the 9 realms themselves, had long been woven into the tapestry of existence, and Loki, the trickster god, was an essential part of that intricate design. His existence, as much a force of chaos as it was one of creation, was bound by the prophecies that had been spoken long before the gods could understand their true implications. From the moment of his birth, Loki was tied to the future of the realms, a future where he would bring both destruction and renewal. Prophecies, whispered by seers and etched into the fabric of time, spoke of Loki's involvement in the end of all things, a dark future known as Ragnarok. The gods were aware of the prophecies, but like all things in Asgard, they were reluctant to accept the inevitability of their own downfall. For ages, they had lived in their shining halls, basking in the certainty of their power, believing that their immortality would never waver. But deep within the heart of the gods, there was an understanding that one day the forces of fate would come for them, and it was Loki, more than any other, who would be the one to bring about the cataclysmic event that would reshape the universe. One of the earliest prophecies involving Loki came from the wise seeress Völva, who spoke of the end of the gods, foretelling that Loki would play a central role in the destruction of Asgard. According to the prophecy, Loki would betray the gods in a way that no one could anticipate, and it would be his children, Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel, who would bring the final reckoning. It was said that Fenrir, the giant wolf, would break free from his chains during the final battle of Ragnarok and slay Odin, his father, while Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, would poison Thor with its venom, ending the thunder god's reign. Hel, the goddess of death, would lead her army of the dead to march upon Asgard, and together the forces of chaos and destruction would overwhelm the gods. But even more disturbing than the prophecy of the children's roles was the prophecy that spoke directly of Loki himself. It was said that Loki, once a trusted ally of the gods, would be the ultimate agent of their downfall. The gods' inability to comprehend Loki's true nature, his ability to deceive, manipulate, and alter the course of fate, made them blind to the impending danger that he posed. The prophecies surrounding Loki were clear. He was the catalyst of Ragnarok, the one who would break the bonds of trust that had held the gods together and set the universe on its inevitable path toward destruction. Loki, ever the enigma, seemed to relish the role that fate had cast him in. His actions, though often motivated by mischief or a desire for personal gain, were always part of a larger design. It was as if he had known all along that his actions would lead to the downfall of the gods, and perhaps, in some twisted way, he had accepted this fate long before anyone else. The gods, who had trusted Loki and welcomed him into their halls, now found themselves betrayed by the very being who had once been their friend. Loki's role in the prophecies of Ragnarok was not one of simple villainy. It was a more complex and darker dance with destiny. As the gods grew older, wiser, and more aware of the prophecies, they began to see the signs of Loki's betrayal. They knew that the time of reckoning was drawing near, and they could no longer afford to ignore the prophecies that had foretold their demise. Yet even as they prepared for the inevitable, they were still uncertain of how to deal with Loki. His shape-shifting, his manipulation of the fates, and his uncanny ability to slip between the cracks of reality made him a god who could never be fully trusted. But the gods knew that they had to confront him, to face the truth of his role in the end of all things. In his heart, Loki seemed to know that his time was coming. The prophecies spoke of his ultimate betrayal, and though he had been a god of mischief and deception for centuries, his actions now carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The gods could no longer pretend that Loki was simply a trickster. He was a force of destiny, and his role in the cosmic order was one that could not be denied. Loki had brought the gods to the brink of destruction, and now he would play his part in fulfilling the prophecy that had always loomed over them. Despite the gods' best efforts to contain him, Loki's ultimate escape was a foregone conclusion. He had known for some time that the gods would seek to imprison him, to silence the chaos that he had wrought. But even in his imprisonment, Loki was a being who could never be fully confined. The chains that bound him, the dark cavern that held him, could not contain the power that lay within him. His mind, sharp and calculating, continued to work in the shadows, waiting for the moment when he would finally break free. The prophecies, however, did not end with Loki's escape. It was said that in the final days before Ragnarok, Loki would join forces with the giants and lead them in a great battle against the gods. The armies of the dead, led by his daughter Hel, would march upon Asgard, and the gods would face their ultimate destruction. In the chaos of the battle, Loki would face his ultimate fate, his own death at the hands of the gods, but not before causing the death of Odin and many other gods. His actions would shake the nine realms to their core, and when the dust settled, the gods would be no more. It would be the beginning of a new age, a new cycle of creation and destruction, where the forces of chaos and order would continue their eternal dance. Loki's role in the prophecies of Ragnarok was clear, but the question remained, why had he embraced this fate so willingly? Was it truly betrayal, or was it something deeper, a recognition of the inevitable forces that shaped the universe? Loki, for all his trickery, had always been a creature of the unknown, a god who had never fully embraced the concepts of order and chaos. Perhaps in the end, he understood that his actions were not merely about causing destruction. They were about fulfilling the natural cycle of existence, where every beginning must have an end. As the final days of the gods drew closer, Loki's fate seemed sealed. The prophecies had foretold that his actions would lead to the destruction of Asgard, but in the end, it was not just the gods who would be affected. The entire cosmos would feel the tremors of his actions. Loki had become more than a trickster. He had become an instrument of destiny itself, a force that would reshape the world and lead to the death of the gods. His betrayal was the final piece in the puzzle of fate, the one that would bring about the destruction of everything the gods had built. Loki's bond with Odin, the All-Father, was as complex and tangled as the very fabric of fate itself. Their relationship, forged through both friendship and betrayal, had seen moments of deep trust, rivalry, and ultimately a growing sense of inevitable conflict. To understand the dynamics between these two powerful beings, one must look beyond the surface to the shared history of cunning, manipulation, and the pursuit of knowledge. When Loki first came to Asgard, it was Odin who saw the potential in him. As the god of wisdom and knowledge, Odin was always seeking new ways to expand his understanding of the universe. He was a god who was willing to embrace unconventional methods in his pursuit of power and wisdom. And in Loki, he saw a kindred spirit, someone whose intellect and cunning could be of immense value to the gods. Odin, who had long been known for his wisdom, recognized that Loki's ability to deceive and manipulate could be useful in the complex world of the gods. Despite Loki's mischievous nature, Odin welcomed him into Asgard, seeing the trickster god as a necessary ally. In the early days of their relationship, Odin and Loki worked together, often sharing secrets and strategies, each benefiting from the other's skills. Loki, for all his trickery, was often instrumental in helping Odin navigate the complicated and ever-shifting politics of Asgard. Whether it was using his shape-shifting abilities to infiltrate enemy territories or crafting schemes to outwit the giants, Loki's talents were invaluable to Odin. The All-Father, ever the strategist, understood that Loki's cunning and intelligence were assets, ones that he could use to strengthen Asgard's position in the Nine Realms. But as with all things in the world of gods and giants, there was a price for every alliance. Over time, the trust between Odin and Loki began to fray. While Odin valued Loki's intellect and ingenuity, he could never fully trust the trickster god. Loki's unpredictable nature His love for chaos and his willingness to bend the rules to suit his own desires made him a volatile ally. Odin, though he admired Loki's cleverness, knew that the trickster god was not to be trusted completely. Loki's loyalty was always in question, and the All-Father understood that no matter how much he relied on Loki, the trickster's true allegiance was always a mystery. The tension between Odin and Loki began to grow, particularly as Loki's actions began to have more far-reaching consequences. The seeds of Loki's betrayal were sown during the events that led to the death of Balder. Though Odin was not directly responsible for the tragedy, he could not escape the fact that Loki's schemes had brought about the death of his beloved son. This betrayal, more than any trick Loki had ever played, marked the turning point in their relationship. Odin, though a god of wisdom, was not immune to the pain of loss. The death of Balder struck Odin to his core, and as the prophecy surrounding Ragnarok began to unfold, he found himself facing a future he could not control. Odin had always been a god of knowledge and foresight, but the one thing he could never fully comprehend was Loki's true nature. For all his wisdom, Odin had underestimated the trickster god, and it was this underestimation that would ultimately lead to the god's undoing. In the aftermath of Balder's death, Odin's anger toward Loki grew. He could no longer see the trickster god as an ally, someone whose wit and cunning could be trusted to help Asgard. Instead, Loki had become a symbol of the very chaos that Odin had always sought to contain. Loki's role in Balder's death was a betrayal of the highest order, one that shattered any illusion that the trickster god could ever be a true companion to Odin. The All-Father, once so willing to embrace Loki's intellect, now found himself at odds with the very being he had once seen as a valuable asset. But even as Odin's distrust of Loki deepened, there was a part of him that could not entirely abandon the relationship. Odin, as wise as he was, recognized that Loki was a creature of paradox, a god whose actions, though often destructive, were also essential to the balance of the 9 realms. Odin understood that Loki's role in the cosmic order was far more significant than mere trickery. Loki was a force of nature, a being whose very existence was tied to the cycles of creation and destruction that governed the universe. And as much as Odin resented Loki's betrayal, he also knew that the trickster god's actions were part of a larger inevitable design. In the end, Odin's relationship with Loki was defined by the tension between their shared history and the growing animosity that would come to define the final days of the gods. Despite all of Loki's misdeeds, Odin could not entirely sever the bond between them. The trickster god, for all his flaws, had once been a trusted companion, and Odin could not entirely erase the memories of their shared victories and accomplishments. But as Ragnarok loomed ever closer, it became clear that Loki's role in the final battle was inevitable. His betrayal, once a distant threat, had now become a reality, and the gods could no longer deny the role that Loki would play in the destruction of Asgard. Odin, who had always seen himself as the protector of the gods, knew that his ultimate fate was tied to the prophecy surrounding Ragnarok. He knew that he would fall in battle, slain by the very creature who had once been his ally. Fenrir, Loki's son, would be the one to kill him, a cruel twist of fate that no god could have predicted. And as Odin prepared for the final battle, he could not escape the truth. His greatest enemy, the one who would bring about his downfall, was not a giant or a monstrous creature, but the god he had once called friend. The relationship between Odin and Loki was a tragic one, marked by both deep bonds and painful betrayals. The Allfather had once welcomed Loki into Asgard, relying on his wit and cunning to aid the gods. But in the end, it was Loki's actions that would bring about the end of the gods. The trickster god, whose role in the cosmic balance was one of both creation and destruction, had finally fulfilled his purpose. And as Odin looked toward the final days of Asgard, he knew that the time of reckoning had come, and that Loki, in his own way, had set the stage for the ultimate battle. So these in the realm of Helheim, the land of the dead, where his daughter Hel reigned as the goddess of death. Hel, though born of Loki, was a being of great power in her own right, and her role in the coming apocalypse would be pivotal. Hel's domain was a place of cold and shadows, a land where the souls of those who died unheroic deaths were sent. Her realm was a reminder of the impermanence of life and the inevitability of death, themes that Loki, as the god of change, could not ignore. Loki's relationship with Hel was one of complexity, for while she was his daughter, she was also a symbol of the cosmic forces that he had long manipulated. Her involvement in the events of Ragnarok was inevitable, for she was one of the many forces that would bring about the final end of the gods. And so, Loki's influence on the Nine realms was not simply one of chaos for chaos's sake. His actions, his manipulation of both gods and mortals, were part of a larger plan, one that was not easily understood. He was a god whose very essence was tied to the forces of change and transformation, and his impact on the Nine realms could not be denied. The realms, from the warmth of Asgard to the cold darkness of Helheim, were shaped by Loki's hand. His actions, whether through trickery, manipulation, or direct intervention, set in motion the events that would lead to the end of the gods and the rebirth of the world. As the gods prepared for the inevitable, they could no longer deny Loki's central role in the fate of the Nine realms. His influence, both subtle and profound, had shaped the course of history in ways that no one could have foreseen. The gods, now aware of Loki's power, could only wait for the final battle, knowing that his legacy would be both the destruction of the old order and the foundation for a new world to come. The end was near, and the echoes of Ragnarok were beginning to resound throughout the Nine realms. The gods, the giants, and all of creation could feel the stirring of destiny. A great reckoning was approaching, one that would bring about the final confrontation between order and chaos, creation and destruction. It was a battle that had been foretold from the very beginning of time, one in which Loki, the god of mischief and chaos, would play a central role. The fates of all beings, gods, giants, and mortals alike, would be decided in this final cataclysmic clash. And at the heart of it all stood Loki, the trickster god, whose actions had set in motion the very events that would lead to the end. Loki, who had once been a companion to the gods, now stood as their greatest adversary. His betrayal, his manipulation of both the gods and the giants, had culminated in the destruction of Asgard and the death of Odin. The prophecy of Ragnarok had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The gods had long known that the end would come, but they had never truly believed that it would be their own kin, Loki, who would bring about their downfall. As the forces of chaos gathered, Loki stood at the helm, leading the armies of giants and the dead. His children, Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel, were at his side, each one destined to play a pivotal role in the final battle. Fenrir, the great wolf, would break free from his chains and slay Odin, the Allfather. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, would rise from the oceans and face Thor in a deadly battle to the death. And Hel, the goddess of death, would lead her army of the dead to storm Asgard and bring the gods to their knees. Loki, for all his cunning and intellect, knew that this was the moment he had been destined for. He had long played the role of the trickster, sowing discord and chaos wherever he went. But in this final battle, there would be no more tricks, no more manipulations. The time had come for Loki to fulfill his role in the cosmic cycle, to bring about the end of the gods and the beginning of a new world. The gods, though weakened by their own hubris and the prophecy that had loomed over them for centuries, did not go quietly into the night. They prepared for battle, knowing that their strength lay not in numbers, but in their unity and determination to face their fate with honor. Odin, though already knowing that he would fall to Fenrir, fought with all the might of his wisdom, commanding the gods to rally against Loki and his forces. Thor, with his hammer Mjolnir, stood ready to face the Midgard serpent in a battle that would shake the very foundations of the 9 realms. As the armies of the gods and giants collided, the earth shook with the violence of the battle. Loki, watching from the battlefield, knew that this was the end, the moment of reckoning that would fulfill the prophecies that had long been whispered in the halls of Asgard. The gods fought valiantly, but it was clear that they were fighting a losing battle. The forces of chaos led by Loki were too powerful, too overwhelming. The gods, though mighty, were no match for the destruction that Loki had unleashed. The battles raged on, each strike of Mjolnir and each blow from the giants shaking the very heavens. Loki, ever the observer, watched with a sense of grim satisfaction. The gods had always seen him as an ally, a companion, a trickster. But now, as the world around him crumbled, he was their enemy, their destroyer. It was a bitter truth that Loki had come to accept. His role in the destruction of the gods was not just a part of his destiny, it was the fulfillment of his very nature. Loki was chaos, and chaos was the natural state of the universe. It was the balance of all things, and the gods, for all their power, had never understood that. In the midst of the chaos, Loki faced Odin for the final time. The Allfather, though weakened by age and battle, stood tall, his eyes filled with both sadness and resolve. He knew that this would be his last confrontation with Loki, the god he had once trusted. Loki, for all his deception, did not feel the joy of victory. Instead, there was only a deep, profound understanding that this was the end of an era, not just for the gods, but for the entire cycle of existence. The destruction of Asgard would signal the end of the old world, but it would also pave the way for the birth of a new one. The cycle of creation and destruction would continue, as it always had, and Loki would play his part in that eternal dance. Odin, in his final moments, tried to reach out to Loki, to remind him of the bond they once shared. But Loki, ever the god of mischief, could not be swayed. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. Fenrir's jaws closed around Odin, the Allfather's life extinguished in an instant. The gods, who had once ruled the nine realms, were no more. But even in the death of the gods, there was hope. As Ragnarok unfolded, the world was destroyed, but it was not the end. The realms would be reborn just as they had always been. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth would continue as it always had, and Loki, despite his role in the destruction, was part of that cycle. The world would move forward as the old gods gave way to new ones, and the forces of chaos would once again be woven into the fabric of existence. Loki, standing amidst the ruin of the gods, knew that his part in the prophecy had been fulfilled. His actions, both good and bad, had led to this moment, and now it was time for the world to be reborn. But Loki was not a god who could be satisfied with simple victory. He knew that the cycle would continue, and that one day the gods would rise again, and with them the force of chaos would rise once more. Loki had played his part, but his story was far from over. The destruction of the gods was only the beginning. Thank you for drifting with me through the grand and tumultuous story of Loki, the trickster god whose schemes and actions shaped the fate of the nine realms. From his mischievous beginnings in Asgard to his ultimate role in the great battle of Ragnarok, Loki's journey was one of complexity and contradiction, filled with moments of brilliance, betrayal, and transformation. As the echoes of this tale settle, may the lessons of chaos and change, of fate and free will, find their way into your dreams. May the stories of gods and giants remind you that all things, even in their most destructive forms, are part of the eternal cycle, and that in the end, there is always a new beginning. Take a deep breath and allow the quiet of the night to surround you. Feel the calm wash over you as you settle into rest, knowing that the world of stories and legends continues to unfold, both in the realms of the gods and in the depths of your dreams. Good night, and may your dreams be as vast and mysterious as the worlds we've explored together.